Hi, I'm Bruce Killian, and I have some exciting things to share with you about the Star of Bethlehem and how God glorified Jesus with a star. This is the second talk in a series. The wise men follow a star to Jesus. We will reveal how God used the unique features of a star to guide the wise men to Jesus' house, when it guided them, and where his house was located. God the Creator did many unusual things to guide the wise men to Jesus. Many believe an angel or supernatural event led them because no star could do what the Star of Bethlehem did. They do not know about God's bag of tricks and the special preparation he made. These signs were not an afterthought. God announced the sun, moon, and stars were to be for signs in the first chapter of the Bible. To make sure men watched the star, God gave signs foretelling what would happen associated with its rising. The nations, including the Mayans and Babylonians, paid close attention to Venus rising with the sun because it was associated with momentous events. God used his brightest star, Venus, the day star, near the brightest portion of its orbit, near the earth, to guide the wise men. God made sure the wise men could see the signs so that the sky for them was very clear, but the sky was not so clear for King Herod's observers. Venus rose before the sun and was visible all day long. Venus sometimes sets before the sun and at other times after the sun. In Bethlehem, the star lingered after sunset, beckoning the wise men to follow it. God had Venus guide them during the evening rather than at night, so that they had sufficient light to walk without stumbling. Since Venus was low and alone in the western sky, there was nothing to give perspective on its distance except the saddle in the nearby ridgeline, so Venus appeared to be near. The ridge runs north-south through Judah, just to the west of downtown Bethlehem, so the star could point to a location on the ridge. God arranged the topography of Bethlehem for this sign. Because the earth rotates, visible stars always appear to move. For that star to appear to stop, the wise men had to move. A moving viewpoint can, rarely and with difficulty, cancel the apparent motion of a celestial object. The wise men ascended the ridge, moving toward the star. Venus descended at a rate that made it appear to stand just above the ridgeline, and it remained at a constant distance above the apparent but ever-changing horizon. The star stood, or better translated, waited. This was the same word used of the parable of the vineyard hirelings who stood or waited until they were hired throughout the day. As Venus descended almost due west in the saddle, it also moved slightly to the north. A slight northward motion of the wise men canceled that motion, so they moved up the hill to the west. A road climbed the hill in the direction of the star. The star they had watched moved steadily across the sky all day long as they moved. Suddenly it appeared to wait for them so that they could catch up to it. This was the one way a star can appear to be followed. It can only be followed as it sets. Because they followed the road, they did not go cross-country over walls and around houses. Because there was no sun, moon, or stars in their western view to provide a reference, they did not discern that it was their motion which caused the star to appear to stop moving. God's trick worked because there was no other heavenly objects in view at the time, because then everything would appear to stop. The only thing giving perspective on the distance was the saddle in the ridge about 500 meters away. They could see the bushes, rocks, and trees, and later a house. So Venus appeared quite close and waiting. For Venus to be visible during the day, there must be sufficient separation between it and the sun. In both of these risings, there was sufficient separation. During the time before Venus appeared, it was closer to the sun. At the first signs on August 24th, 2 BC, Venus rose with the sun, but it set in the west 50 minutes before the sun. So Venus appeared to be going a long way ahead to the west. When Venus next rose with the sun on March 27th, 1 AD, Venus rose just before the sun, but fell behind, setting 24 minutes after the sun. God designed a very special star that rarely, but when needed, could guide in ways that no other star could. 3 months earlier, an angel announced the birth of the Christ or the Messiah to the shepherds, keeping watch in fields by night. The shepherds in Bethlehem were Levites. They had the duty to inspect sacrifices to verify they were without defect. On the night of his birth, they inspected Jesus and verified he was without defect. This was a very exciting thing that happened to them in an otherwise uneventful life. So they told everyone what they saw and heard, and they did so as soon as the people woke up in the morning. Since the Bible announced the time of Christ's coming, and the time drew near, so everyone in Judea anticipated his soon arrival. When the shepherds announced his arrival, nearly everyone in Bethlehem would promptly come to the cave to see the Christ. King Herod also investigated. Mary and Joseph knew of the evil of King Herod, so when the shepherds left, they packed up, cleaned up, and left the stable. They did not go to the inn. Rather, they went into hiding. Any publicity would put Jesus in mortal danger from King Herod. While Mary and Jesus hid, Joseph probably first fixed up the house, then worked in Jerusalem to avoid attracting attention with his presence in Bethlehem. When the first people came to the cave at first light where Jesus was born, there was no evidence that anyone had been there. Providentially, shepherds were considered habitual liars. The boy who cried wolf story comes to mind. The shepherds must have concocted this story of angels and of the baby Christ while they kept watch at night. Shepherds could not testify in court because they would lie. So when the baby was not found, the story died out. But there is a hint King Herod knew of the story because he told the wise men to search diligently, implying his men had searched unsuccessfully. Jesus was outside the town center, so his cries did not attract attention. King Herod sent the wise men to Bethlehem. They did not need a star to guide them south 5.5 miles to Bethlehem. The star could not guide south because there was no way to recognize it had stopped. And if it stopped, it could start up again to lead them. But when they got to Bethlehem and asked about a newborn king, they heard the 3-month-old story secondhand about the Christ, but could not locate the child. There were young boys in Bethlehem, but there was nothing to make it appear that any was a new king. The wise men could not question the shepherds because Passover was near. They took their flocks to Jerusalem to sell the lambs to the pilgrims. It is likely the wise men concluded that they had arrived too late. The boy king was born, but already gone. A great disappointment. They arrived in Bethlehem about 3 days before the star would rise again, and most people left to go to Jerusalem for Passover. The wise men could watch the star rise from nearly anywhere in Bethlehem, so it was likely the wise men watched from near the Bethlehem Inn. The inn was a logical place for them to eat and sleep during their stay. The inn was located on the road into town, so travelers could find it. The topography of Bethlehem's hills and valleys dictates that one route they took. Otherwise, as they went up and down hills, they would have lost sight of the star. It is logical for the road to go directly and smoothly uphill. The story of the Star of Bethlehem is recorded in Matthew chapter 2, but Luke also subtly mentions the star as the dayspring, Luke 1:78 and 79. Through the tender mercies of our God, when the dayspring shall dawn upon us from on high, to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the road of peace. The dayspring rises at dawn with the sun. It gives light in the dark, so it was still visible after sunset in the evening. It can guide on the road of peace. to Jesus, the Prince of Peace. Since the star rose at dawn in the east and was visible near the sun throughout the day, and then appeared to wait low over the ridge in the west, it went before the wise men, then stood over or waited where the child was. As the star approached the saddle in the ridge, it descended, but it was also moving to the north. The path of the wise men, therefore, was slightly south of west and curved to the north from the west to counter the apparent motion of the star to the north. Jesus' house was not visible from the town below until the wise men got close to it. When they did get close, the star was over the house where Jesus lived. What happened to the star? Why did the star disappear over Jesus' house? The star descended behind Jesus' house. It appeared to enter his house. A little humidity was all it took, an invisible cloud behind his house. So a cloud played a part in the signs in the heaven at Jesus' birth. West is the direction we would expect moisture to come from. Jesus said, "When you see a cloud rising in the west." The atmosphere near the horizon dims the light of heavenly objects. That is why one can look at the sun as it sets. As Venus descended, it became increasingly likely to disappear due to the atmosphere. This slide gives two snapshots of Venus and the sun after sunset. Venus in the upper picture is as it appeared just after sunset. The lower picture, it was as it appeared 24 minutes later. The red arrow shows the direction of motion. Because the wise men's horizon was lower at Venus set than it had been at sunset, the time from sunset to Venus set was actually longer than 24 minutes. This is an old map of a portion of Bethlehem showing some topographic features. The green house is the approximate location where Joseph's home was located in the ridge saddle. Starting from the inn in brown, the red line marks the route the wise men traveled, and it curves because the star descended. They had to veer slightly to the north. The map grid is at 500 meters. The wise men may have walked less than 500 meters if the inn was closer to the saddle. The cave or stable is marked by a blue dot. It was away from the inn, so the Holy Family had a private location to birth Jesus. This is 4 sequential views of what the wise men saw. The black line diagrammatically shows the horizon as seen on the ridge. The top view is first and the bottom view last. As the wise men climbed the road, the gray line, to the saddle or notch, the star slowly descended. Because of the change of the horizon due to the ridge, the star appeared to wait for them to arrive. Once they reached the summit, the house in blue the star led them to became visible. This is a view as if the ridge was sliced through, so that we can see the wise men's horizon changed, so the star's position would appear to remain fixed. Even though the star continued to move, it appeared to wait because its distance above the apparent horizon remained constant. The saddle was nearby. It was not 30 miles away. They could see rocks and plants. They would be inclined to think, let's go over there and see what it's leading us to. The Jewish day started at sunset. The time of day the star brought the wise men to Jesus' house turns out to be significant. It led them to arrive about twilight on Passover. That was just as Passover meal called the Seder would start to be celebrated in Jerusalem. Passover was the most important of the Jewish feasts, and 32 years later, Jesus would die a few hours before the start of this feast as the Passover lambs were being slain in preparation for being eaten to celebrate the feast. No one would have been following or paying attention to the wise men because the law required men to celebrate Passover in Jerusalem. They would be there, many with their families celebrating the feast. If King Herod had assigned soldiers to watch the wise men, They would be released from duty that day to celebrate the Passover. It is noteworthy, Matthew notes, the wise men visited Mary and the child. Another proof of Passover. Joseph was not at home. He was in Jerusalem as required. So no mention of people following the wise men to Jesus' house. One can imagine, on most days, when it was light enough to travel, the wise men would have been accompanied by people, particularly children, to see what they were doing. At nightfall, that is when 3 stars could be seen in the sky, the Passover feast would start. The Jewish Passover was always a full moon, so as the sun set in the west, the full moon and Jupiter rose in the east. Later that night, the Holy Family fled by the light of the full moon. They fled Israel for Egypt on Passover, the opposite of the Exodus, where Israel fled Egypt on Passover. The wise men could walk to the saddle in 15 or 20 minutes, so they had a few minutes to decide what they should do after sunset. The arrival of the wise men at Jesus' house seems to be timed to be coincident with the time the Seder meal would start in Jerusalem. This strongly links Jesus to the Passover. The wise men worshipped Jesus and gave him gold, frankincense, and myrrh. In Israel, land passed from father to son. Joseph was a direct male descendant of King David, who was a direct male line descendant of Boaz and Ruth. Since Boaz and Ruth slept at a threshing floor, it is likely Boaz's property included a threshing floor. The saddle in a ridge location would be an ideal place to build a threshing floor. Since Boaz's property was on a ridge, it is logical that his heir would build or rebuild a house in the same general area. A rocky ridge would make a good foundation for a house. A threshing floor was the place where grain heads were beaten or crushed, and then the grain separated from the chaff. They were built at flat, rocky places where the grain was tossed into the air and the wind winnows or caused the chaff to blow away and the grain collected. The best place for a threshing floor would be in the saddle of a ridge that runs north-south. The prevailing westerly winds would be channeled and concentrated. Roads go to saddles because they are the logical place to cross the ridge and to join the north-south road linking Jerusalem and Hebron. So, we have biblical and astronomical evidence that this saddle in the ridge above Bethlehem was the location where Joseph's house was located. Archaeology could locate the road and probably the house. They might continue to dig and find David's house. It is quite reasonable Joseph rebuilt on his ancestral land and their house was located there. Since Joseph had ancestral property, why didn't the Holy Family go directly there to give birth to Jesus? It was probably late, raining, and the house needed repair before it could be used. This is purportedly a picture of Bethlehem, which shows the ridge profile. The ridge profile may be seen from the west or from the east, depending on whether it's sunrise or sunset. The sun is near the notch the wise men were guided to. I believe this is an 1890s picture of the area where Joseph's house was located. It shows a cobblestone road, much like a Roman road. The wise men could have followed this road. Why did the wise men rejoice with exceeding great joy? Because after waiting in Jerusalem for more than a month, they realized that sometime in the middle of the night, Jupiter would come into a stopping point in its month-long retrograde motion, crowning the star Regulus, something it did every 83 years. Utter nonsense. They rejoiced first because the day was clear and they could see the star. Then, because it marked a slain lamb in the sky in a city of sacrificial lambs. Third, because it guided them to the house where Jesus lived and stopped and waited until they could identify exactly where the star was leading them. The star helped them to meet God in the flesh. God did many things to guide the wise men. It was not accidental. So many unusual things. Many have believed it was impossible that the Star of Bethlehem could be a real star. Venus moved directly to where it led them and waited, and it was a special day and time. When their quest seemed to have failed, God in His grace gave them great success. What should this story cause us to do? The wisest of the Gentiles, the wise men, invested their time, talent, and treasure to diligently seek and to worship Jesus with exceeding joy. They gave gifts from their abundance, and so should we. They found Him, as we do, with His mother Mary. God recorded this story as an example for us. Therefore, it behooves us to diligently seek and worship Him with exceeding joy as well. Creation points to Jesus as the light of the world. He will guide us so that we don't stumble in the darkness. Jesus as the light can guide us if we choose to diligently seek and follow. And if we do, we will not stumble in the darkness or lose our way. The Star of Bethlehem emphasizes the link between Jesus and the Passover. In the next talk, there will be additional evidence. The next talk will focus on when Jesus was born and how the heavens worshipped Jesus. God used His star to guide them, the knowledge of which has largely been lost today. He used a star that could be seen during the day, a star that could rise before the sun, yet remain visible after the sun had set. It took careful observation to see the star, but these were professional star watchers. God used the brightest star in the sky, His star, to lead the wise men to Jesus. The wise men paid close attention to the star. God had organized history to cause the nations to pay attention to the risings of this star. God wanted this event to be known, and it was very precisely timed so that we could know when these events took place, so that we could make the connection between Jesus and the Passover, which He came to fulfill. This information has remained largely hidden in our day. For more information, check out the articles linked in the notes below.